Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. I hope everything's working this time because last time I had some problems. Anyway, let's hope it's gonna work. So, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. And is it working? Is it working? Is it working? Is it working? Tell me it's working. Okay, apologies. Anyway, so the plan for today, for me, basically, is I'm really grateful to have this wonderful opportunity to talk like this outside of class without the usual constraints of the courses that I teach, right? And so basically, the purpose of the talk, so to speak, today is to discuss the issues around personal identity. So this is another question that kept coming up, especially in the first semester, in a whole host of different contexts. So I thought I'd meditate on this a little bit, right? So in many ways, this discussion right here is an overview of work in progress, so to speak, right? And this question of personal identity, right? What am I? Is a very important question. This is, among those questions. I mean, unifies some of the topics, unifies some, within this broader question, unifies some of the topics that got me interested in philosophy in the first place, right? And the kinds of questions that still very much motivate me, right? And so I do teach philosophy of science and political philosophy these days. And in many ways, this topic of personal identity kind of spans both disciplines. And I hope I'll be able to show some of the intersections in a second, right? And so so if you want to be more specific, so we can talk about metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics, all in one question, right? United in this question of what is a human being, right? So it's kind of a crime to not refer to Kant in this context. So Kant had his famous 4 questions. What can I know? What should I do? What can I hope for? And Kant famously says that these 3 first questions should be referred to the 4th one. What is a human being? What is a human being? Or what is a man? Was ist der Mensch? Right? And in many ways, that's the spirit in which I want to proceed today. To tackle this as the most important question, which kind of has all these other 3 questions in mind, which is why I just said a second ago that I see this as an intersection between metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics, right? And here's a reference to Kant in case you're wondering. He talks about the 3 questions in the Critique of Pure Reason, right? And he wraps it up in this with a 4th question in his Introduction to Logic. Anyway, in case you're wondering. So I suppose the thesis, conclusions up front, right? So it's important to keep in mind, so that we're not lost at sea, to keep in mind as a beacon, what is the conclusion I'm trying to reach, right? So the tentative conclusion, again, take it with a grain of salt, it's a spirit of open dialogue, right? But still, the conclusion, which is kind of controversial, I understand, and kind of radical, is that the self does not exist, right? So we read all these books, we write them, we study all these courses. So I teach all these courses, at the university. And the conclusion, the grand conclusion is that, we don't exist and nothing matters. Yeah, in many ways, sounds kind of radical, but I would say that the task of philosophy in the 21st century is basically to wrap our minds around this question. In many ways, it has been, I think, the question of philosophy maybe since Nietzsche at the forefront of our thought, which is why I think Nietzsche in many ways defines our modern intellectual horizon, but be that as it may, right? And so the thesis is basically that the self does not exist, and to try to somehow unpack this, right? So you could say that the self doesn't have any diachronic substantiality, right? So the self does not really exist through time as a substantial entity. There is no such thing as a self. Cartesians will snap back at me and say, well, but I think therefore I am. I have this direct, immediate access to my consciousness, so I must exist. Okay, yeah, maybe. That's a separate question, has its own problems, especially, Wittgensteinian private language types of problems. But, let's not get into that. Let's grant that you exist at this given moment. But what about existing through time as a substantially, like ontologically substantial entity? That's a bigger issue, right? And my contention is that, or the tentative conclusion I'm trying to achieve in this discussion today is that no, there's no such thing as as a diachronically substantial self, right? So the second conclusion is that the self, if it doesn't have any apparent, any real substantiality, what the self is merely an apparent result of stable constellation of opposing forces. It's merely an apparent result of a stable constellation of opposing forces, right? So this, if you want, Heraclitean palintropos harmonia, right? Balance of opposing tensions, but no real substantiality, right? So there are forces fighting between each other constantly, and there's a certain stalemate in this tug of war, and this is what we call constancy. But in fact, there's nothing constant underneath this constancy. Process ontology. Say hi to Heraclitus, right? And the ultimate conclusion is that meaning is meaningless and purpose is purposeless, right? So this Darwinian anti-teleological inversion. I'll talk about this some more, hopefully, in a bit, right? But I think very often people have this notion, and I certainly had this notion, right, that universe was somehow, if you believe modern physicalist picture, you would say universe was somehow dark, right? But now, throughout this billions of years of evolution, finally consciousness has evolved, consciousness has achieved self-consciousness, and this darkness is illuminated, right? But what I'm trying to reach the opposite conclusion, and the opposite conclusion would be that no, actually consciousness is just as unconscious, as undirected, as dead, dark, inanimate matter, if you want. So this grand reversal. So these are going to be my three conclusions. And I'm not sure how much I'll be able, how far I'll be able to progress towards these conclusions today. But in many ways, all of the classes I teach, one way or another, dance around these issues. So, and many of the videos on this channel are trying to fill out this picture. Anyway, let's try to continue somehow. Oh yeah. So let me again. I'll give you some quotes, but before I give the quotes, so in many ways this question for me has a very deep biographical significance, right? So I think like in the first year of my bachelor's program, when I was introduced to philosophy, I got deeply interested in these kinds of issues through the work of René Descartes and David Hume. I guess these would be the two important skeptical philosophers who had a huge impact on me as a freshman, right? And so again, so this feeling of vertigo, this feeling of losing your ground beneath your feet, right? This realization that human knowledge is deeply precarious, that we do not really have access to anything like substantial truth with a capital T, but in fact all of our knowledge is radically limited and ultimately hypothetical, right? So this was a very daunting realization, I guess. At some point, well, again, when I was a freshman, and this is basically what got me interested in philosophy, right? And so specifically, again, this highly pragmatic question of trying to ask yourself, like, what are you? What is a human being, and what is our purpose here? Again, this is why I'm tempted to start every class I teach with at least a brief discussion of Heidegger, right? And this notion that we are thrown into this world, geworfen, right? We're thrown into this world without a manual. We don't know what to do. We find ourselves. We always already find ourselves in this situation, but and the situation is pushing us in certain directions, right? But if we stop and think about this, there is a certain realization of groundlessness beneath our feet. Are we really sure that what we are doing is the right thing, right? The limitation of human knowledge has this practical consequence that I am not sure what I should be doing right now. Some more to be said about this, but still. And this traumatic, I would say, experience, right, got me going in philosophy in the first instance. And in many ways, I would say, still animates me to a large extent. Anyway, but the two ways, I think, two direct ways to tackle this question of what is the self and what is the meaning of human existence, what is the purpose of human existence, right? It's through neuroscience and through critical theory, for me at least. Right? This was for me biographically. Although again, I still think that these are the two very important, privileged ways of knowing about what human beings are, right? And neuroscience teaches us that consciousness is simply a product of electrochemistry of the brain. Now, people are gonna jump back and say, well, neuroscience doesn't have all the answers yet. Yes, neuroscience doesn't have all the answers yet, okay? It's true. But, from everything that we can see, in terms of the progress of science, I think that the hope that there's going to be some kind of different explanation is very slim. We have these debates between the vitalists and the mechanicists about life, basically 100 years ago. But with the discovery of the DNA molecule, we don't have these debates anymore, right? So, and my philosophical stake, right, my philosophical gamble, if you want, is to simply assume that the neuroscience is true. And I think that's a fairly robust position to take, right? So the consciousness is merely a product of the neurochemistry, of the electrochemistry of the brain, which itself is simply a physical process, like any physical processes, right? And our basic understanding of fundamental physics, which is incidentally why I got so interested in fundamental physics, right? Tells us that, within the equations, within the Schrödinger equation, for example, there's no such thing as aim or purpose or goal or values, right? There's no place for objective values. You simply have these vibrations in the quantum fields exchanging energy packets through virtual particles or something like that. The Schrödinger equation governs the evolution of the Hilbert space, something like that. The wave function of the universe evolving according to the Schrödinger equation. Anyway, and so this is the neuroscientific part of the story that. And which again, I suppose that the neuroscientific picture has to be supplemented with a Darwinian evolutionary account, right? Which tells us that ultimately all of this is a product of purposeless evolution by natural selection, right? So let's add this here. But again, it means that in an important respect. Again, human beings and human life in general is a result of these processes which themselves, this basic physical processes, which themselves are blind and directionless, right? So this is one side, maybe an easier side to start with. And the second side, in terms of critical theory, starting with people like Rousseau, but Nietzsche, also Darwin, Freud, Marx. I could throw David Hume in there, but for me personally, very importantly, figures such as Foucault, Derrida, and Lacan, right? This idea that, again, if Foucault is right, if Derrida is right, if Lacan is right, then yes, in a deep fundamental sense, again, this is post-structure, sometimes referred to as post-structuralism or even post-humanism, right? So this, maybe let me add this to the slide. So the post-humanism of these philosophers, right? The idea that human beings are actually products of larger structural forces, right, of cultural evolution. Foucault is going to talk about history and genealogy, right? Marx is going to talk about this base and superstructure model, how consciousness is derivative from the material base, right? And so you get this double-pronged attack. So on the one hand, neuroscience tells us that we are just machines, and on the other hand, critical theory, social theory tells us, psychology of Lacan and Freud tells us that we're just machines, right? So this double-pronged attack, moving in the same direction. So I suppose to feel this a little bit more from a different perspective, you can also talk about two other ways. So not talking about neuroscience and critical theory, but talking about view from the inside and view from the outside. So when we talk about view from the outside, I think this, broadly speaking, I'm reminded of a distinction between Leib and Corpora, which I think in the works of German philosophical anthropologist whose name escapes me. Anyway, doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter too much. So in terms of, again, scientific anthropology, right? Science of anthropology tells us that human beings are a combination, like we're a combination of the products of our genes, right? Which are themselves a result of biological evolution through natural selection, right? And also, like, if you want to use this phrase, which I think was coined by Richard Dawkins, memes, which is the result of historical evolution of social forms, right? And so this would be, if you want, nature, nurture, instinct, and society, whatever, right? So we have this interesting interplay of co-evolution of biology and culture. In passing, I should probably note that, of course, as far as we can tell from the scientific standpoint, our biological makeup, our genetic makeup was actually influenced by our sociality. And our sociality definitely is very much influenced by our biological makeup. So there's a certain, less of a chicken and egg problem and more of a, like a, these are two dimensions of the same process problem, right? So these are the processes which feed back. There's a feedback loop between these two processes, is what I'm trying to say, that we shouldn't expect a sharp distinction between the two. Anyway, that's a topic for another day. So anthropology, like a view from without, a view from the outside, tells us that we are products of biological and cultural evolution. So the view from the outside, right? And the introspection gives us the view from the inside, right? And from the inside, yeah, okay, there are certain natural illusions of, you know, this Cartesian theater that, oh, I am a subject in the world of objects, I am free, rational subject in the world of mindless, meaningless material objects, or something like that. But still, I think that deep and honest introspection gives us a very different picture of ourselves. Deep and honest introspection reveals a completely different picture of ourselves, right? So if we sit down, if we try to meditate, if we try to pay attention to what goes on in our consciousness, if we try to, again, be attentive to what goes on in our mind, we actually discover that we are deeply driven, that we are deeply anxious, that there's a certain deep element of, deep character of passivity to our mental life, that things happen to us, things that we do not choose. You know, desires arise from the depths of psyche, thoughts just pop into our head, right? So okay, we make choices. Sometimes we have this feeling of making choices, but we always make the choices on the basis of things that we do not choose. Sometimes, you know, students ask me, like, why do I, well, in interesting contexts, students have asked me in the past, why do I get up in the morning? And my honest answer is that I don't choose to get up in the morning. In many ways, my body takes over and gets me up in the morning. And if I try to resist that, whatever the word I means in this context, it would be hard for me to resist, right? It would be difficult. It's the same thing as, you know, putting the favorite philosophical example, putting your hand on a hot stove, right? You can try to force the hand down, but the feeling of pain will, you know, your body will take over. Instinctively, it will retract the hand. And in the same fashion, I want to say that we wake up in the morning driven to do certain things, driven to get out of bed under normal circumstances, of course. But let me continue, right? And so, you know, the last bit about unconsciousness, right? So we have this discovery ever since David Hume and Friedrich Nietzsche and Freud, of course, right? This realization that so much of our life is completely unconscious, like uncontrollable by us, right? Nietzsche writes in this Über Wahrheit und Lüge, right? So on Truth and Lies in Extramoral Sense, wonderful book, right? Nietzsche writes about how, you know, the coils of the intestines, right? So the functioning of our body is mostly unconscious. We don't control the digestive system, right? So again, in this metaphor that Freud will later use, Nietzsche talks about consciousness as if being like a rider on a tiger. The rider may have an illusion that the rider is in control, but in fact, it is the tiger who decides where the body goes, so to speak, right? The tiger of the unconsciousness, of the unconscious, if you want, right? And so over the years, I have developed this phrase. It's kind of, I'm not sure, well, like these are the words that kind of stuck together as I was trying to express this, that human beings are anxious and mostly unconscious products of larger forces of biological and cultural evolution. Right? Products of larger force of biological cultural evolution. And when we think about this, when we see, try to, you know, construct a genealogical picture, genetic account, if you want, of how did we get here. So Stephen Jay Gould or somebody, everything is the way it is because it got that way, right? Anyway, so where do we come from? We are manufactured by these forces of biological cultural evolution, manufactured not to be happy or to find meaning in life or lasting satisfaction, but we are manufactured to fulfill a certain function within the logic of self-perpetuation of these systems of biological and cultural evolution, right? And I used to finish this phrase by saying that we want things that we do not really need, and the things that we really need are the things that we cannot in principle get. I'm not sure if I want to talk about this quite right now, but let me add this to the slide. Maybe I'll come back to this later. So we want things that we don't really need, but the things that we really, really need, we cannot in principle get. It's a phrase which is inspired by Jacques Lacan. Reading Lacan was, I have to tell you, was a very important therapeutic experience for me. Very therapeutic and very liberating experience. So like in general, I was actually kind of thinking about maybe doing this as a separate video. Let me just add a note here, right? So when does critical theory or doing philosophy in general turn into cheap self-help? But let me just add this to the slide. And again, the reason I bring this up, is because very often when I teach classes about these kinds of topics, I do get this uncanny feeling that I am sliding into some kind of very cheap and banal self-help. But I gotta say that in general, this understanding that human beings do not have freedom. We are products of these larger forces. And in fact, in some deep sense, maybe we don't even exist, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, right? This was a very liberating experience for me, right? And I have been interested in Buddhism for a very long time, and I feel that the core of Buddhist philosophy offers very similar insights. But for me personally, biographically, the realization, this moment of thunder, came when I was reading Lacan's seminars, specifically the seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis. I don't think that there was something specific which I have read. I don't think that there was maybe a specific passage, but really just reading this book and looking at Lacan, trying to explain the workings of human psyche in these structural terms over and over and over again, right? This gave me immense liberation. And, I suppose this is a symptom of our culture, and, it's maybe a bit of an oversharing, but let me tell you, the most important feeling I felt is freedom from guilt. And by contrast, I felt back then, and I kind of feel now, that in general, I feel that my personal upbringing, but sort of, I think this is normal in terms of our society, this notion of guilt, which is ever present, this idea that, as children are born, we implant in them the notion that they always owe something to somebody, like especially like you owe it to be useful to society, something like it's on you, right? And to me, again, I was kind of thinking maybe this is another video for another idea for another video, is again this notion of a reversal, right? So like these days, whenever I think about this, especially in terms of John Stuart Mill, right, this notion that having children is a free decision. Presumably in 2020, for most people, at least for most people who are listening to me right now, to have or not to have children is a free decision. And so unless you have a reasonable expectation that your children are going to be happy, right? Why should you have them at all, right? So it's like my feeling these days is that, very, very contrary to the way I was brought up, is that it's not like children owe something to society, but in this, quasi-Gnostic fashion. So compared to the Gnostics, if you want, right? Life is suffering. Gnostics or Buddhists are going to say this, right? Life is suffering, and if you dare to have children, you are responsible. So parents are responsible to children for giving birth to them, with respect to children, right? Let me put this with a question mark again. I want to elaborate this at some point. Of course, when I say this, parents are responsible to children, the whole point of this video is that the self does not exist and responsibility does not exist. How do I square one with the other? Well, there's a way to square them. I think that we use the word responsible in kind of different senses, but we'll get there. I suppose before I proceed, let me read just several quotes. These may be slightly out of order, but still. So, or at least maybe not read, but at least point to some quotes. Again, another quote which I really like to give at the beginning of classes I teach is this quote by William Golding from a wonderful book, Darkness Visible, which is at the same time, I think, the most interesting and the most boring book I've read at the same time, paradoxically, but it is a book of paradoxes. Right, so again, in terms of this goes with the introspection, right? So I'll leave it to you, I guess, to read the quote. But again, the metaphor that Golding is using here is a very vivid metaphor. He talks about a dark tunnel from the back at the back of the head, the dark tunnel at the back of the head, and from this dark tunnel we can feel certain thoughts and ideas pop into our mind. I think this is such a wonderful metaphor. Again, it's stuck with me for many years, ever since I first read it. Another quote which I want to give, and this quote is much closer to home. This is a quote from Michel Foucault talking about Nietzsche. So Foucault and Nietzsche are very important philosophers for me. Foucault used to be the most important philosopher in my head, the most important interlocutor. I mean, I started reading, I told you a story about Lacan. I started reading Lacan basically because I was branching out from Foucault. Lacan was, I mean, an idea that there's a certain connection between Foucault and Lacan, right? And so I've read Lacan as a way of making Foucault more clear. Let's put it that way, right? So so this is another phrase which I found very important and very inspiring for the last maybe 15 years or maybe more, right? And so this Foucault talks about, right, that history, the way Foucault understands this, and again, I'm also thinking in terms of Marx and, of course, in terms of Nietzsche, right? History, the way Foucault understands this, right, leads to this systematic dissociation of identity. The I that is an empty tautology. This identity, this unity, is only a mask. It's only a parody. In fact, behind this mask of unity, what we find is a plurality, countless souls disputing, vying for control. He says, numerous systems intersecting and competing. So I talked about this. We are products of larger force of biological and cultural evolution. We are not just unitary products. Yeah, we are systems which are fighting against one another. Let me again make a note, a modular theory of the mind. I'm not going to talk about this now, but this is definitely an excellent topic for a future episode. Another modular theory of the mind. I think another very interesting intersection between neuroscience, broadly speaking, and critical theory, or if you want social theory. I'm using critical theory here quite broadly. Anyway, right? So he talks about, again, so these again, the human being is not a whole, a single whole, right? Human being is just a locus of a battleground between different systems which are intersecting and fighting for control against one another, right? Yeah, and wonderful quote from Nietzsche that we don't have one immortal soul, but we have many mortal souls. Wonderful quote this is from Nietzsche, right? And in these souls, there's not there is no somehow forgotten identity to discover, right? Ready to be reborn, but in fact, a complex system of distinct and multiple elements unable to be mastered by powers of synthesis, right? And maybe even I could add this idea, again, Foucault's famous phrase, Foucault's famous inversion of Plato's formula. So Plato famously says that the body is the prison of the soul, of this singular immortal soul, right? And Foucault inverts this, and he says, no, it's actually the soul which is the prison of the body. And, the soul is the prison of the body, right? And one way to understand this is, again, in terms of these, there is no substantiality to the soul. There is no substantiality to the body. This is a complex of systems, and controlling human emotional, psychological life through a system of stimuli, right, or maybe through a certain training regimen, right. This allows, through the control of the psyche, to control the body. Who controls at the end of the day? Well, nobody controls. Power is structural and anonymous. Again, which is an idea which is there in Foucault, but it goes back to Marx, and it goes back ultimately to people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Charles Montesquieu, and maybe even to Giambattista Vico. Which is why, again, these days, the most important course I teach is the course on modern political theory, where we talk about these six thinkers: Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Mill, Hegel, and Marx. Right? And I feel that in many ways it's much more important to read these philosophers and to understand them very carefully. than maybe to get lost in the newfangled, currently fashionable philosophies. In many ways, I feel, maybe Nietzsche should be added to the list of those 6 thinkers. But in many ways, I feel that the ideas, let's say, of Rousseau are as current, are as applicable in our day as they were back in Rousseau's day. Maybe even I'll get a chance to talk about this a little bit more. So this is the quote in French. I like this phrase. Des âmes innommables, right? Innumerable souls. Anyway, okay, so another quote. This is from the Buddha, right? From the, depending on how you want to pronounce this, in Sanskrit this would be Anatma Lakshana Sutra, right? So, or in Pali, Anatta Lakshana Sutta, right? So this idea, and I'm not sure I should read the entire quote, but again, Buddha emphasizing this idea that, again, when we introspect, we see this fundamental inconstancy and inconstancy and uncontrollability of our internal mental life, of our internal psychological life. We feel, if we pay close attention to the phenomena of our consciousness, we begin to see them as external, alien in some sense, right? And through this dissociation, through this realization, right, Buddhists are supposed to achieve liberation, nirvana, right, freedom from desire, and those kinds of things. Do I want to talk about this more? Well, a million other things to say. I'm not sure, do I want to advance some of the classical arguments about the identity of the self? I suppose, this kind of argument, right, that careful introspection reveals a certain constant stream of phenomena, of experiences, right, which are mostly inconstant and mostly uncontrollable. This is the most important argument against the identity of the self, right? So these arguments are, broadly speaking, mirrored by philosophers like David Hume, for example, right? And so Hume against the self, right? And Hume's argument is very, in some sense, very basic and wholly negative, right? He says, I'm an empiricist. I believe what I see. When I look inside, I see many different objects of experience, but I never see the self. I never see the constant self, right? This constancy is just an illusion of apparent continuity, right? Where is it? Where is it, right? The past is only a fleeting memory. The future is just an anticipation. I find myself in the now, right? The metaphor that some Buddhists like to use is like, you can imagine the universe being destroyed and recreated every moment, from moment to moment, right? And the two, again, destroyed and recreated, like, and the two universes, which only exist for an instance, are like slices, right, of something. Let's say slices of a cucumber or something like that, right? And they look similar, but in fact, there is no deep ontological continuity from one point to the next. Something to, just a metaphor to think about. So yeah, so in many ways, and again, I talked about this in one of the earlier videos this year about the ship of Theseus, right? So am I the same person I was 1 second ago, 10 minutes ago, a year ago, 10 years ago? And in many ways, there is no good answer. Well, I mean, first, we don't know. There is no good answer to this question. But honestly, there's no reason to postulate an enduring self throughout these moments. What is constant, what gets reborn, at least according to Buddhists, would be karma. You exist maybe only momentarily, right? But what gets reborn is karma, which is this external, coercive, causal structure of cause and effect. So I and myself in the past, we are linked via a chain of cause and effect. But am I the same person? Well, not necessarily, not exactly. Why should I assume that I am the same person? I feel responsible. Well, yeah, I feel responsible, but there's a lot I inherit from the past, right? So in this sense, also incidentally, maybe I should talk about this right now. So one other thing I kind of wanted to mention is this linguistic constitution of the self, or linguistic or narrative constitution of the self. Again, this idea that the continuity is externally imposed, right? So we human beings, we exist, but in addition to existing, we also describe our existence in a certain way, right? And this leads to a certain kind of doubling of consciousness, right? So there's a basic consciousness, and there's a self-consciousness on top of it. I'm kind of reminded of this wonderful phrase by I am a strange loop, right? I am a strange loop. Anyway, but the point is that, again, like me, I'm making this video right now. I'm recording these words. Why do I record these words? Is there something ontological in my soul which leads to the birth of these words? No. There's a certain, again, external structure. There's a certain script. There's a certain narrative which exists as a material, I don't know, electrical potential inside my head. Neurologically speaking, but also culturally speaking, am I the author of these words? No way. I mean, I inherit a particular culture, right? So these ideas do not just spring into my mind randomly, right? The culture equips me with certain tools to think about these ideas. Not to mention that these ideas are not very, very original, right? I keep referring to Foucault, to David Hume. I could refer to some other books I've read, like a host of other books I've read and talks I've listened to and classes I've been to, right? So, David Hume and Daniel Dennett and, Sean Carroll, right? So, and Robert Sapolsky, why not, right? So, and all of these names, all of these words, in some sense, I am just regurgitating, just repeating things I've heard from other people in the past. So even in this sense, I mean, you are listening to my voice. In an important respect, I am listening to my voice. I am listening to me saying these phrases I've said so many times before, never on camera, I think, but in class. Right, to students, explaining these kinds of questions, right? I'm not sure I want to go into this, but Rousseau talks about this interesting distinction between amour de soi, which is this natural emotion which he ascribes to primitive humans, but also to animals, and then there's this amour propre, right, which appears through language, this linguisticality, Sprachlichkeit, right? This very important idea. Now, so when we talk about this linguistic narrative constitution of the self, in many ways, I feel that there's a very productive formula to actually run this through, right? This idea that there's undifferentiated unity of consciousness without the self-consciousness. Of let's say, of a simple consciousness. Undifferentiated unity is a word that's usually used to describe Hegelian philosophy by people like Jerry Cohen, for example, but still. So and this is sort of this simplicity and childlike innocence, right? We can compare this to maybe the I'm thinking maybe to something in Nietzsche, but I'm not sure, right? But then we go through this phase of differentiated disunity, right? Of, again, like of consciousness at war with itself, of this, let's say, self-consciousness at war with itself. And then the idea is, can we get to the other side of differentiated unity, right? Of harmonious self-consciousness? And I suppose people like Foucault would always ask this, would be tempted to ask this question: yeah, is this real harmony, or is this just a successful deployment of force? This is something like that. There's more to be said about these terms, and maybe I should make a whole video on this at some point. But it's an interesting set of phrases. Yeah, I think the immediate context for discussing this would be Hegel's master and slave dialectic, whereas this would be the stage of the master. This would be the stage of the slave, who is at war with him or herself because they have to obey the will of the master, the will of somebody other than themselves. And the differentiated unity would be, well, let me maybe use the word citizen, right? Because clearly Hegel pays a lot of attention to that kind of thing. Something like that. Another, so this is kind of not necessarily going somewhere, but let me try to maybe start wrapping this up, right? So another reason why this whole idea is kind of important, right, is we have this teleological versus mechanistic worldview, and the current worldview is mechanistic as opposed to the traditional teleological understanding, right? And the mechanistic worldview talks, again, Kant said it best, I should have added this to the slide, right? This notion of the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. Der Schlund des zwecklosen Chaos der Materie, right? The abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter, right? That, okay, we have the wave function of the universe evolving according to the Schrödinger equation, right? There's no deeper meaning or significance to whatever goes on, okay? So we have this interesting initial condition of the Big Bang, and now the second law of thermodynamics, entropy is just increasing like a ball rolling downhill, and the life is just a small eddy, a small vortex on the way of an increasing, inexorable increase in in the entropy in the universe, right? So again, so Kant will talk about this again as the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. And this very much should remind us of Thomas Hobbes, which is one reason I am so fascinated by Hobbes, right? And so we are talking about a deeply amoral universe, non-moral universe, right? There is no objective capital V values. We have merely subjective small v values, right? Which are not really values, but simply psychological causes of behavior, right? Like Hobbes says, whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire is that which he calls good, and the object of his hate and aversion is what he calls evil, there being nothing simply and absolutely so. What we like, what we want, we call good. What we are averted from, right, we call evil, right? And so we have this idea in Hobbes, Hume, and Mill. In many ways, this goes back to Epicurus. I have this small caveat with Nietzsche and the is-ought problem. I'm not sure I want to talk about this now, but sort of just let's make a note that there is a caveat with this simplistic picture of objects of desire, people calling good, objects of aversion, people calling evil. Basically, Nietzsche, in some sense, is saying we don't have to do it this way, right? There's no compulsion, actually. And that's an interesting question, whether it is or is not so, right? But let me kind of, I feel that I'm working at the same time in two quite different registers, right? So I'm talking about, I said the self does not exist, and there's no responsibility, but at the same time I say, parents should be responsible to their children, right? Or I talk about this, how we are the self is an empty tautology. The identity is imposed from without. We have this, linguistic narrative constitution, discourse, power of the discourse, right? And yet at the same time, I talk about this differentiated unity of harmonious self-consciousness. How do we square one with another? Well, in many ways, I don't want to minimize this problem. This is a very difficult problem. This is one of the leading problems, I would say, for philosophy in the 21st century, or the way I see it in my own head, right? But basically, again, so we are talking about, if you want, this mechanistic determinism and some notion of political freedom. What does it mean to be free, right? So the straightforward compatibilist account is that to be free is simply to be determined by the right kinds of causes, and that's okay. We should be happy with that, right? And but what does it mean to be determined by the right kinds of normal psychological causes? What does it mean for the individual to choose rather than forced to choose or forced to do something, right? And so we have this immanent psychological criterion, right? So we have these wonderful Greek words such as ataraxia or eudaimonia. And I should note that there is a big problem in my head in thinking about ataraxia, which is comparable, I think, to Buddhist notion of nirvana, which is that, you know, like if I ask myself, why am I recording this lecture? For the sake of, so ataraxia again refers to this feeling of calm and tranquility, you know, letting go. The way to set, you know, this ascetic way to satisfy desire by getting rid of desire, right? So, ataraxia is the ideal of happiness through freedom from desire, right? And eudaimonia is this Aristotelian ideal in which, no, actually, you know, we have this rose in full bloom. We have a satisfaction of appropriate human desires, you know, satisfaction of desire, right? And I can ask myself, what the hell am I doing right now? You know, the Epicurean, the Buddhist, the ataraxic way to sit down, to meditate, to let go of your desires, right? Or am I catering to my ego, right, in recording this lecture, right? So, trying to satisfy my desires, right, in this quasi-Aristotelian or maybe, you know, Millian or Marxist, quasi-Millian or quasi-Marxist fashion. And I have to say that, you know, this is a little bit of therapy, self-therapy maybe. I do feel that there's a tension between my job as a university professor and my philosophical thinking, because very often what my philosophy tells me is, you know, that I should pursue tranquility, I should pursue calmness, you know, sit down and meditate, do yoga, these kinds of things, be with myself right now, and, you know, breathe and let go. But on the other hand, I am driven to solve these questions, to talk to students, to, you know, record these kinds of videos, right? And again, I feel that there's a certain tension. Of course, you know, the day when I will, you know, if I ever resolve this tension in favor of the Buddhist way, unfortunately, that's going to be the last day I'm going to record anything on, right? So it's like the first day of my truly Buddhist career will be the last day of my university professor career. I feel. But maybe there's a way. So, you know, to me, there's at least a question of a tension between these two ideals in philosophy. But be that as it may, right? So we're talking about, you know, physical as determinism and some kind of notion of political freedom, right? So if everything is force, how can there be, you know, again, this external coercive idea, you know, going back to Foucault maybe, right? How can you have, you know, this, what does it mean to be caused by the right kinds of causes? What is this, again, a peculiarly unforced force of the better argument that Habermas talks about? You know, is there really such a thing, right? So Foucault would ask this question, I feel, very much of Habermas. What of Foucault? Foucault urges us to be very critical of these kinds of notions. Oh, unforced force, you know, the only force that a free citizen recognizes is the purely unforced force of the better argument. But still, that's the idea, and that's the ideal. I'm kind of, you know, when I started doing these slides, I thought this would maybe cohere slightly better. But I also had this notion, you know, at this point to talk about, again, this Hegelian notion, right? So like, and you know, is this paradoxical? Yes, this is paradoxical. There's definitely a deep tension between these two. But somehow I'm trying, maybe not very successfully, but at least we need to try. I need to try to bridge this gap in my own thinking, right? So on the one hand, I talk about human beings being products of larger forces, biological, cultural evolution, human beings not having substantiality. But on the other hand, there's this ideal, and again, I told you, my motivation for doing philosophy in very many ways was this critical motivation, again, starting with critical philosophers such as Descartes and Hume. But at the same time, one of the earliest experiences in my engagement with philosophy was actually going to a lecture on Hegel, of all people. And this lecture impressed me very deeply because in the course, I mean, like, my reading in Descartes, in Hume, and in Foucault, and to some extent in Marx, had led me to this very sinister worldview, very sinister maybe is not the right word, very anxious worldview, this notion that the universe is at war with itself, this Heraclitean notion, right? And this radically conflictual ontology, right? That society is just full of, you know, power struggles constantly, right? And you feel like you're losing ground beneath your feet. And here I was in a lecture theater listening to, again, a lecture on political philosophy of Hegel. And Hegel talks about, a very different ideal, entirely different ideal, right? He talks about this free rational obedience, right? Or freedom through obedience to the rational law, right? So, and again, this notion that, in this end of history, free individuals, rational individuals, freely choose to obey the rational law, right? So individuals are rational and the law is rational. And so you freely choose to obey, right? Again, freedom is obedience to the rational law that you have prescribed to yourself. Freedom as this autonomy, right? This notion of positive freedom and this idea of a harmonious society. And the question is, how do you square one with another? Yeah, and I feel that there's a tension. Right? So on the previous slide, I talked about this ataraxia and eudaimonia. This is definitely the way of eudaimonia, right? Eudaimonia, not ataraxia, right? Ataraxia is this anti-political solution to the problem of philosophy, right? Sort of. In many ways, we can see this maybe in Rousseau talking about Socrates and Cato, right? So Cato is the political solution, and Socrates is the anti-political private solution, right? And so it's like, in many ways, if we talk about this immanent criterion, right? So it's like maybe the first best or this ideal utopia is this conflict-free society at the end of history where the free development of each, as Marx says, is the condition for the free development of all, right? This is like the first best utopia. But then comes Foucault and says, well, this all sounds like dangerous ideology. This sounds like exactly the kind of discourse that produces docile and submitting bodies. So Foucault's answer, in this sense, I feel, especially in his hermeneutics of the subject, is deeply anti-political. Again, is a way which, I'm not saying that Foucault embraced ataraxia, but it's a way which points towards ataraxia, right? This freedom and autonomy of the individual within their own head. But of course, after Foucault has talked about how the individual is a battleground of these conflicting forces, what is this internal autonomy? How do you achieve ataraxia? Well, you achieve ataraxia through some sort of internal struggle and internal restructuring, trying to harmoniously restructure the elements of your own psyche, right? But still, in many ways, after Foucault, or like alienation after Derrida, or liberation after Derrida, there's nothing to liberate. After Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Darwin, there's nothing to liberate because liberation is just another form of determination. So that's in many ways that's the question, that's the issue. Liberation in Hegel, or just another form of determination. And why does it matter if I don't exist? If that's the point of if this was the whole thesis I was trying to advance today, if I don't exist, why does any of this matter? And I suppose the answer is it matters in the same way that it matters to me if I put a hand on a hot stove. Sextus Empiricus talks about the appearances forcing themselves on us, right? So this the unsatisfactory nature of existence, forces itself, upon me, and the two answers I can see: unsatisfactory nature of existence, right? As Heidegger would say, existence is perpetually an issue for us. We cannot choose to not care about our existence, right? But the two answers are the Buddhist ataraxia, or the let's say Buddhist, let's be Buddhist Epicurean ataraxia, or the Marxist Hegelian eudaimonia. That's where my thinking stands right now, and I wonder how many people are really still listening and not have just decided that I've gone off the rails. These are, interestingly, this is a list of names I was kind of planning maybe also to cover in today's talk, but Maybe I should try to wrap this up now. I don't know. I hope this was stimulating. I promised this was going to be a little bit thinking out loud. Maybe this was a bit too much thinking out loud. I feel that I've gone off the rails maybe somewhere halfway through the video. But you see, I mean, I told you. You see, like in class, we have certain constraints and certain topics I want to pursue, but there's never time, right? And I promise that, again, the videos this is going to be the primary function. For me to be able to talk about things there's never time for in class. Well, maybe that's a good reason there's no time for this in class. Well, no, actually, hopefully, this is work in progress. Hopefully, I'll be able to come back in some time and give you an update on my thinking on these issues. But anyway, colleagues, if you're still here, thank you very much for your company. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to engage in dialogue, especially with people who are interested in these kinds of questions, right? This is ultimately what moves conversation forward and what makes this whole worthwhile. So anyway, in the spirit of these, in the spirit of John Stuart Mill, I guess, again, appreciate your company. I hope you found this stimulating, maybe. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me, I guess. And otherwise, colleagues, stay safe, take care, whatever that means. And hopefully I'll see you around. I'll see you around next time. Take care.